Hi everyone, welcome back to my lab and today's video, which is going to be my review and demo of the new Sephora Pro. This is the Pro Pigment Palette, the Editorial 2.0 palette. I recently shared my Sephora VIB sale haul, or part of it. The rest is still coming. And I wanted to share reviews on the products that you seem to be most interested in. So I've already done the Bobbi Brown Ultraviolet palette, which I really enjoyed. And that's my previous video if you haven't checked that out yet. But today is going to be on this one. I got a lot of questions about this one and also the Huda Beauty New Nude palette. But that one is a lot more popular and there's a lot more content regarding that palette on YouTube right now. So I thought I'd focus on this one. I'll also film an overall makeup haul update video, just letting you know how everything worked out. I am wearing a lot of the products on my face right now and I'm really loving my makeup today. However, I will not be recommending this palette. So if you're interested in seeing why, then let's go ahead and get started. So let's get a few basic details out of the way. Sephora Collection recently launched 3 more Pro palettes additional to their original 3 palettes that they launched. Of the original 3, I own 2. I do have the original Editorial palette as well as the warm one. When I saw the launch of the 3 new ones, I was really interested in those palettes and this was the first one that I picked up. The outer packaging looks like this. This one has a metallic copper. On the back you do have a colorful grid letting you know what shades are in the palette, some ingredients, just some basic information about the palette. Similar to the original 3 palettes, this comes in a very heavy plastic palette. You do have a very large mirror that spans the entire interior of the palette, and on the inside you have all of your shades and the shade names have actually been printed on the palette. If you saw any of the original Sephora Pro palettes, they did not have the shade names. They had a plastic sheet with the shade names on it that was removable. So that was a feedback that they responded to very well. In this palette, you do have 28 different shades in a mixture of finishes, and each specific shadow is 1.2 grams, which is a generous amount inside an eyeshadow palette. The shelf life of the palette is 12 months, and it was made in the United States. Please be aware that the palette is not vegan as it does contain carmine, and also Sephora Collection is not cruelty-free. The palette does retail for $68, although I purchased mine in the Sephora VIB sale, so I paid a little bit less. I paid about $55 for my eyeshadow palette. I did mention in my haul video that the palette comes with a pamphlet with 4 different looks that you can achieve using the eyeshadow palette. I really like that they included different skin tones and also different eye shapes. But for example, if you're interested in this look right here, which is a little bit hard to see under the lights, but at least you can see it's only 2 eyeshadow colors. And it's the same for the rest of them. And I wondered, why in such a large eyeshadow palette they would only be using 2 or 3 shades in the most part. And I realized why that is when I started using the palette. I'll insert swatches while we chat about the palette so that you can take a look and see how the different shades swatch. Now I have to say that what you see with this palette is not exactly what you get, or at least what you might expect is not what you're getting. For one, I expected this shade, which I am wearing today, the shade is Trans. I expected it to have its own pigment and I expect it to function like a metallic shadow, but it really isn't that. It's more of like a glittery top coat kind of shadow, and I realized that in order to retain the green pigment, I had to layer it over a green shadow. Similar to this shade here, the shade Coven, which appears to be the darkest shadow in the palette, doesn't have very much color payoff at all, so I'll insert the swatches so that you can take a look. Now, originally I was happy that there was a mixture of matte and metallics in the eyeshadow palette, but now looking at it closely, if you look at the palette, out of the 28 shadows that are present here, only 8 of them are matte. Now, in my opinion, it's missing a few colors. I love the color story. That's what drew me to this palette and why I started with this one when I was showing my haul. I was especially drawn to the greens, which is why I'm wearing them on my eyes, but I've also tried on the different magentas and I've tried the purple shades. I've not applied the blues to my eyes yet. What I noticed when I was using the palette is that with regard to the matte, I always create the foundation for my eye looks using matte eyeshadows. In my personal opinion, there's not enough matte eyeshadows within one color family to really get a nice gradient. And even though the eyeshadows themselves blend out very nicely, if you want to do very detailed work like a darker outer V or something like that, which I'll mention in my demo, it's not going to be really possible with this palette. I did try to layer, for instance, the shade Omen with the shade Talisman, which is the only darker shade option that is matte, and I realized that the matte matte shades do not layer over one another very well. The second shade that you apply almost immediately falls off as soon as you try to blend. So that's one definite negative point with the palette, and that's something that I realized when I started trying to use it. I have used this palette about 5 or 6 times now, and I've used a lot of the shades, and I was just caught off guard with the color payoff on some of them. Like I mentioned, I discovered that this one, it has to be layered on top of another color, and then because they don't layer very well, I have to use a sticky base. It was just really challenging, and for the price of $68, I was a little bit disappointed and honestly really frustrated at the beginning. There's definitely a learning curve with this palette. If you're still interested in the palette, then hopefully my legwork on how to make the palette work will help you out. I still think the color story is really fascinating, but I do have a recommendation for an alternative palette for you to check out if you're still interested in something like this. Another thing that's important to mention is that the mattes are really chalky, which is something that's very typical for the Sephora Collection eyeshadow palettes. However, they apply really well. They have very nice pigmentation, but again, if you start layering a lot of colors together, they don't layer so well. I did find that with the rose colors, there's a lot more variety in the matte shades here and here, so you can get a little bit better of a normal blend with the typical way that at least I do my makeup. Now you're gonna see in the demo that the way I apply this palette is totally contrary to the way I typically do my makeup. I usually start with a transition shade and I get darker and darker as I work my way down from the transition. With this palette, I started with a lid shade and I worked my way out, and even so, I felt I was missing a darker shade to darken the outer corner. So despite the fact that I'm really happy with my eye look, I had to fight really hard for this one. Really hard. And with a price tag of $68, my patience is sort of limited. I expect the performance of a $68 eyeshadow palette. If I was working with something a little less expensive, then I don't mind putting in that extra time, but it just took me a long time to figure out how to use the palette because of the learning curve. It's not a palette I recommend for beginners, and it's also not a palette I would recommend for professionals because number one, it's pretty heavy. I don't think you're gonna wanna walk around with this in your kit, and number two, it is tedious to use. I'm not a makeup professional, but I've been applying makeup for a long time, and I'm pretty comfortable with my skill set. I'm no pro, but I'm alright, and it's just very tedious to work with an eyeshadow palette, and if you're on set working on a client, it's just gonna take too long for something like this. And I feel that it's more of a companion palette rather than a standalone palette as well. I mean, I wouldn't expect that from a 28 pan eyeshadow palette. It should be able to stand on its own, and I just feel that there's a few things missing for the types of looks that I typically like to do. Now that being said, I have learned how to use the palette, and like I said, I'm really happy with the eye look that I created. I think it's really pretty, and this color story is really unique here. I really love it. I'm personally gonna keep it, but I really wouldn't recommend it, especially not to a beginner. Also, I realize that this is a color story that's not gonna appeal to a lot of people. It's a fun eyeshadow palette, has really nice pops if you want to use 1 or 2 shades in conjunction with other palettes that you already have. Now, originally I thought that this palette might go really well with the original Editorial palette. Okay, here's the original right here. You can see the shade names are not printed, and interestingly enough, the mattes are more prominent in the pink and purple family again, which is the stronger suit of this palette, but at least you have some additional blues and greens that you can definitely pair together. If you don't already have this palette, you can definitely pair this with like the NYX Brights palette or something like that to help you have an easier time blending some of these shades if you find that you have some of the struggles that I do. Now, do I think it's worth $68? No, I don't. And for that price tag, I expect to be able to use my palettes the way I typically use my palettes, and I don't want to feel that I'm missing anything. Now, if you were really curious about this palette, which I know some of you were from the comments on my video, I do have a recommendation for an alternative palette. I haven't used it yet. I just recently purchased it because I really like the color story, but I think that the shade textures were much more intelligently selected with regard to how most people apply their makeup. So I'm going to show you that. So I'm comparing the Sephora palette to the Morphe Boss Mood palette, I think it's called. Yeah, Boss Mood palette. I just purchased purchase it, like I said. But if you notice, there's a lot more mattes in the Morphe palette, and even though the Morphe palette is missing the blues, if the color story that you are attracted to was more in the green family, you can see that you have a lot more color options for matte greens as well as different metallic finishes, and the same in the more mauve or purple family. So this palette has 35 eyeshadows and it retails for $24, and the Ulta non-prestige coupons do apply. So if you were just trying to play with some colorful shadows, I would just start here, because honestly, with the effort that I put into applying this shadow, I could easily apply the same effort to applying a less expensive palette and not have to spend as much money. It's just my personal opinion. I'm just offering it as an alternative. I haven't used this palette per se, but I've used other Morphe shadows and I can typically make them work. And what I really liked about that palette was just the ratio of mattes and shimmers and the selection of the matte shades themselves. I just thought it was more in tune with the way I personally apply my makeup. So back to this little pamphlet, I can definitely see why each look that they propose really just has 2 or 3 shades at most. The one on the back has a couple more shades, but this is again in the more pink red family, which I mentioned do have a lot more blendability. As far as applying the shades, I think that the shadows perform fine on any kind of eyeshadow base, but for the metallic ones, you do need a sticky primer. I would recommend that you use glitter glue. In my eye look today, you'll see that I created my eye look after applying my makeup, and I didn't really have any issues with fallout, but again, I was applying those shades onto a sticky base, and that's inclusive of the eyeshadow primer that I used. I left it, I didn't set it, and I applied the mattes directly onto it, and it's just been the best way I have found to apply the eyeshadow. Alright, so enough talking. Let's go ahead and get into the eye look so that you can see how I created it. It's super simple, but it took me a long time to get there. It was a struggle, and part of it is the way the eyeshadow is formulated, and part of it is my own fault because my eye is really watery, and when you're working with powdery mattes in combination with watery eyes, let's just say I was really frustrated the past few days. I'll go ahead and switch to the demo so you can see how I created the eye look. I'm going to begin this look by priming my eyes with the P. Louise makeup base, and I am not going to set it. I'm using a MAC 249 to apply the eyeshadow base, and I'm not going to set it because that's how they recommend to use this specific eyeshadow primer. And then also, these shades are so, let's call them moody, that I really need something for them to stick to. Once I've applied it fully, I'm going to keep my eyes downcast so that it doesn't crease. With the Fenty Beauty number 200 brush, I'm going to take the shade Omen, and I'm going to pack that all over my lid using tapping motions. Next, I'm taking the Fenty Beauty 210 brush and the shade Sense. And even though this is a blending brush, I am tapping the color again. There was a huge learning curve for using this palette, and it's not the eyeshadow base. I tried it with many different bases and I had the same issues. So I'm just going to pat it right above where I put the shade Omen, and I'm only going to begin to blend after I've built up the color. Now that I've put the color down, now I'm going to use windshield washer motions, and it doesn't blend it fully, but it's the best I've been able to achieve with the palette. Next, with a Morphe G15 and using the shade Wish, I'm going to apply that to my brow arch. And this is the same shade I'm going to be applying to my inner corner. And once that's applied, I'm just going to blend the edges. Next, I'm taking a Sonia G Crease One brush, and I'm going to apply the shade Omen to my lower lash line. So as you can see, it's a very simple eye look to recreate, but again, I struggled so much learning how to use the shadows that I had a lot of failed attempts. I'm also going to drag this up to where the yellow, more yellow shade and the more green one meet to blend a little bit further. After working with the palette a few times, I realized that there's just not a lot of base color to that shade. And so that's why I put the matte all over my lid, and I'm going to layer the metallic over the matte. It's the best result that I've been able to achieve. So I'm using glitter glue instead of the makeup base because the glitter glue is a little more translucent. So hopefully you can see that as I apply it, it doesn't really change the color of the base. And that's what I want. That's what's going to allow it to retain that color. And now with the MAC 242, I'm going to pack that shade using patting motions. And I have to be very careful to place it where I had the glitter glue to avoid any fallout. And that's your eye look so far. Now ordinarily I would use a deeper shade in the outer V of my eye, but this palette doesn't really have a green in that shade. The blues don't work that well on it. And then I tried using the shade Talisman, which is the maroon shade, and I struggled with that one as well because the mattes don't layer really well on top of each other. So this is the best that I can do if I stick to just this palette. It would have been nice if it had a black shade. So this is the basis for the eye look, and to be perfectly honest, I really like it. But I struggled for so many days to achieve a look that I was happy with the palette. I don't know. In any case, I finish off the look with a black gel wing liner. I use my Maybelline Eye Studio for that. And I also apply a yellow liner. This is the MAC Chromographic Eye Pencil. And this is in the shade Primary Yellow. I love this. It's really pigmented on the waterline. And I do apply some false lashes. The lashes I apply are by Allure by Ann Lee. I'm not sure who she is, but it's a vlogger series. So I'm sure she's got a YouTube channel. And I'm gonna go do all that off camera and return to show you the finished look. And here's your finished eye look with all the finishing touches applied. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed seeing that demo, and you saw, if you've been watching my channel for any length of time, you know that that is not the way that I typically apply my makeup. It's just a technique I was trying, especially as I've seen it used when people use the P. Louise base, where they sort of pat the shadows on and blend afterward. So I found that it worked well for my palette. Again, I'm going to be keeping it, although I think there are better ways to spend your money if you haven't purchased it already. If you do purchase it, hopefully the tips that I gave you are going to help you enjoy your palette a little bit more. That's everything for today's video. If you did find it helpful, don't forget, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions that I didn't address, leave those in the comment section down below, as well as any requests for any other items that you saw in my haul that you would like to see me give priority to in terms of reviews. Also, stay tuned as I have a makeup haul update regarding all those brushes and powders and different things that I bought, as well as the remainder of my haul, which I've not shared yet. If this was your first visit to my channel, I'm Yori. Thank you for joining me today. If you did enjoy this video, then hopefully you'll consider subscribing and joining me for a future one. Thank you so much for your time today. I hope you're having a lovely day, and I will see you again very soon on my next one. Bye-bye.